Your thighs are burning, your jaw is tight, your breath is slow and controlled. You are not moving. Not a single muscle fiber is shortening or lengthening, you are just holding. And for exactly 4 minutes, something is happening inside your arteries that cardiovascular researchers did not fully understand until recently. Something so specific, so measurable, and so surprisingly powerful that it has begun to quietly rewrite the exercise recommendations coming out of major health institutions. This is not about going to the gym. This is not about running. This is about stillness under tension and what it does to the vessels that carry blood to every organ in your body. If you have ever wondered whether the quieter, harder to explain forms of physical effort actually do anything, the answer is yes. And the mechanism behind it is one of the most elegant things happening inside your body right now. If this kind of deep dive science is useful to you, and it means the next time we go this deep on something, you will already be here waiting. Now, before we get into what isometric exercise does to your arteries specifically, I want to build the foundation properly. Because the mechanism only makes sense if you understand what your arteries are actually doing when you are alive and moving through the world, which is something most people have never been taught in any useful detail. Your arteries are not pipes. That is the first thing to understand. They are not passive tubes that blood moves through the way water moves through plumbing. They are living tissue. The walls of your arteries are made of smooth muscle cells, elastin fibers, collagen, and a critical single-cell thick interior lining called the endothelium. The endothelium is, without exaggeration, one of the most metabolically active tissues in your entire body. If you could spread it flat, the endothelium of a single adult human would cover a surface area of roughly 700 square meters, the size of a tennis court. It is enormous, it is everywhere, and it is doing things constantly. It is sensing the mechanical pressure of blood moving through it. It is detecting chemical signals in the blood. It is releasing compounds that relax or constrict the surrounding muscle. It is regulating clotting, inflammation, and the passage of materials through the vessel wall. The endothelium is not decoration, it is the control system. And the compound it produces that we care most about in this conversation is called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide, abbreviated NO, is a gas. It is produced directly by the endothelial cells lining your arteries, and its primary job is to signal the smooth muscle in the arterial wall to relax, which causes the artery to widen, which drops resistance, which allows blood to flow more easily to the tissues that need it. This process is called vasodilation. In a healthy cardiovascular system, this is happening dynamically all the time. Your heart beats, pressure pulses through the arteries, the endothelium senses that pulse, releases nitric oxide in response, and the artery accommodates. It is a continuous, elegant feedback loop. The enzyme that produces nitric oxide in the endothelium is called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, or ENOS. And here is the detail that connects everything. ENOS is activated by shear stress. Shear stress is the friction force that moving blood exerts on the interior wall of the artery. When blood flows faster, shear stress increases. ENOS activates us on more nitric oxide is produced, and the artery opens up to accommodate. When blood flows slowly or irregularly, shear stress drops, ENOS activity drops, and over time, the endothelium becomes less responsive, less healthy, and more vulnerable to the inflammatory processes that lead to atherosclerosis. This is the fundamental story of arterial health. It is a story about shear stress, nitric oxide, and endothelial function. And isometric exercise enters this story in a way that took researchers years to fully appreciate. Here is what happens during an isometric contraction. You hold a position, a wall sit, a plank, a grip hold, a static lunge. The muscles involved are generating force, but they are not changing length. The joints are not moving. And because the muscles are under sustained tension, without rhythmic contraction and relaxation, something very specific happens to the blood vessels running through those muscles. The sustained muscular tension compresses the local blood vessels partially, creating resistance. Your heart has to push harder against that resistance to maintain perfusion. Blood pressure rises during the hold, sometimes substantially. And then, when you release the contraction, the compressed vessels open, resistance drops suddenly, and blood rushes back into the previously compressed tissue. That rush of blood creates a surge of shear stress on the endothelial walls of those vessels. ENOS activates. Nitric oxide floods the local circulation. The arteries respond. This post-exercise surge in shear stress and the endothelial response it triggers is a central mechanism behind what isometric training does to your vascular system, and it is why the effect shows up not just locally but systemically in arteries far from the muscles you were holding. This is where the research becomes genuinely remarkable, and I want to walk you through it carefully because the numbers are more significant than most people realize. In 2023, a team of researchers led by Dr. Jamie Edwards at Canterbury Christ Church University in the United Kingdom published a systematic review and meta-analysis in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. They analyzed 270 randomized controlled trials covering over 15,000 participants, comparing the blood pressure effects of 4 major types of exercise: aerobic exercise, dynamic resistance training, high-intensity interval training, and isometric exercise. The results were not close. Isometric exercise produced the largest reductions in both systolic and diastolic blood pressure of any exercise modality tested. Specifically, isometric training reduced systolic blood pressure by an average of 8.24 millimeters of mercury and diastolic blood pressure by an average of 4 millimeters of mercury. For context, that systolic reduction of 8.24 millimeters of mercury is roughly equivalent to the effect of a first-line antihypertensive medication. This is not a small signal. This is not a fringe finding from one underpowered study. This is the aggregate of 270 trials and more than 15,000 participants, and isometric exercise came out on top. The British and Irish Hypertension Society subsequently updated their exercise recommendations to include isometric training, specifically citing this body. If you want to take a moment right now and save this video, you can come back to the specifics of the protocol later. The practical part is coming, and it is simpler than you probably expect. Now I want to explain why the effect is specifically strong for blood pressure, because there is a mechanism here beyond just nitric oxide, and understanding it changes how you think about this kind of exercise entirely. When you perform an isometric contraction and hold it, you activate what is called the muscle metaboriflex. Metabolically active muscle produces byproducts, hydrogen ions, lactate, adenosine, potassium. These compounds accumulate locally during the hold because blood flow is partially impeded by the compression. Chemoreceptors in the muscle, called group 3 and IV afferent fibers, detect this chemical buildup and signal the cardiovascular system to increase cardiac output, raise blood pressure, and redirect blood to the working muscles. This is your body trying to flush the metabolic waste. It is a powerful cardiovascular stimulus. And here is the important part. When you hold for long enough, typically around 2 minutes or more, and then release the sudden resolution of that metabolic pressure, the rush of fresh blood into the previously compressed tissue trains the arterial system to respond to that pressure relief with enhanced vasodilation. Over repeated training sessions, the endothelium becomes more responsive. It produces nitric oxide more readily. The arterial walls become more compliant, meaning they flex and accommodate pressure changes more effectively. Arterial stiffness, which is one of the primary independent risk factors for cardiovascular disease, measurably decreases, and that stiffness reduction is what shows up in the blood pressure numbers. Softer, more responsive arteries do not need as much pressure behind the blood to perfuse the tissues. Pressure drops. Heart works less hard. The downstream consequences extend across your entire cardiovascular system. There is another layer to this that I think is important, and that is often left out of these conversations. Arterial stiffness is not just a cardiovascular risk factor in isolation. It is connected to brain health in ways that are only recently becoming fully appreciated. Your brain receives approximately 20% of your total cardiac output. It is exquisitely sensitive to pressure dynamics in the vessels supplying it. When arteries are stiff, the normal pulsatile wave of blood pressure, the ripple that travels through your vascular system with each heartbeat, is transmitted further into the brain microvasculature than it should be. In healthy, compliant arteries, that pulse wave is dampened before it reaches the small cerebral vessels. The large compliant arteries act as shock absorbers. When they stiffen, that dampening is lost. The pulse wave hits the small brain vessels directly. Over years, this contributes to white matter damage, reduced cerebral blood flow regulation, and increased risk of cognitive decline and vascular dementia. Research published in journals including Hypertension and Arteriosclerosis, Thrombosis, and Vascular Biology has documented these associations consistently across large population studies. What reduces arterial stiffness improves not just your heart's long-term health, but the health of your brain as well. Isometric exercise, because of its specific effect on arterial compliance via the endothelial nitric oxide pathway, sits directly at the intersection of these two systems. Let me now tell you what the actual protocol looks like, because this is where the practicality becomes striking. The most studied isometric exercise in the blood pressure research is the isometric wall sit. You stand with your back flat against a wall, lower until your thighs are parallel to the floor, and hold. The protocol used across most of the trials in the Edwards meta-analysis involves 4 2-minute holds with 2-minute rest periods between each hold. Total active holding time, 8 minutes. Total session time including rest, approximately 16 minutes. The target intensity used in the research is typically around 20 to 30% of maximum voluntary contraction. That sounds technical, but in practical terms it means working hard enough that you feel sustained muscular effort, but not so hard that you cannot maintain the position for 2 minutes. You should feel it. Your legs should burn by the end of each hold, but you should be able to complete the hold. 3 sessions per week is the frequency used in most of the trials showing blood pressure reduction. Not 7 days a week, not every morning, 3 sessions. The research showing effects on endothelial function begins to show measurable changes after approximately 6 weeks of consistent training. The blood pressure reductions seen in the meta-analysis came primarily from trials lasting 8 to 12 weeks. This is a relatively fast physiological adaptation curve compared to many cardiovascular interventions. The walls of your arteries are not permanent structures, they are living tissue, they respond, they adapt. And 6 to 8 weeks of 3 session per week isometric holds is apparently enough to begin bending that response in a meaningful direction. Now, wall sits are not the only option. The other isometric exercises with solid research support for cardiovascular outcomes include isometric hand grip exercise, which uses a hand grip dynamometer or a simple tennis ball, squeezed at submaximal effort for repeated holds, isometric leg press, isometric plank variations, and seated isometric push and pull exercises. The hand grip protocol deserves specific attention because it is perhaps the most accessible of all of these. A 2019 study published in the Journal of the American Heart Association by Gillian McGowan and colleagues examined the effects of isometric hand grip training over 8 weeks in adults with elevated blood pressure and found significant reductions in both systolic and diastolic readings. The mechanism is the same, but the site of maximum shear stress and endothelial activation shifts to the vasculature of the forearm and hand. The systemic effect persists regardless of which muscle group you are training. This has important implications. It means that people who have joint limitations, chronic pain conditions, or mobility restrictions that prevent lower body isometric exercise have a fully validated upper body alternative that produces the same category of cardiovascular adaptation. The body does not care which muscles generate the metabolic stimulus. It cares about the stimulus. There is something worth acknowledging here about why this information has not reached more people more quickly. Part of the reason is structural. The exercise research ecosystem, historically, has been dominated by aerobic exercise studies because aerobic exercise is easy to standardize, easy to measure, and connects neatly to decades of prior work on cardiac output and oxygen consumption. Resistance training research expanded significantly through the 1990s and 2000s, but isometric training specifically, because it is harder to monetize, because it requires no equipment for many protocols, because it does not fit cleanly into either the cardio or the strength training marketing categories, has received proportionally less popular attention than its clinical evidence base probably warrants. The evidence for isometric exercise improving blood pressure and endothelial function has existed in smaller studies for 20 years. The 2023 meta-analysis simply aggregated enough of it in place and applied enough statistical power to make the signal undeniable. Research rarely moves in dramatic leaps. It moves in the quiet accumulation of consistent findings until the weight of the evidence becomes too heavy to ignore. The Edwards meta-analysis was one of those moments. I want to spend a moment on who this matters most for, because while the general principle applies broadly, the clinical significance concentrates in specific populations. Approximately 47% of American adults have high blood pressure by current clinical definitions, meaning a systolic reading at or above 130 millimeters of mercury, or a diastolic reading at or above 80. That is roughly 116 million people in the United States. The standard first-line intervention for stage 1 hypertension in people without other cardiovascular risk factors is lifestyle modification, including exercise, before pharmacological intervention. What the Edwards meta-analysis tells us is that if we are counseling people with elevated blood pressure to exercise, and we want to maximize the blood pressure reduction per unit of exercise time invested, isometric exercise outperforms the alternatives. This does not mean aerobic exercise is not valuable. It is. The cardiovascular adaptations produced by sustained aerobic training, including improvements in cardiac efficiency, mitochondrial density, and VO2 max, are distinct from the endothelial and arterial compliance adaptations produced by isometric training. The two modalities are complementary, not competing, but for the specific outcome of blood pressure reduction, the evidence now places isometric exercise at the front of the line. There is also emerging evidence worth tracking on the relationship between isometric exercise, nitric oxide production, and metabolic health more broadly. Nitric oxide is not solely a vasoactive compound. It plays roles in glucose metabolism, specifically in improving insulin sensitivity in skeletal muscle by facilitating glucose transporter activation. Research published in diabetes care and related journals has documented the relationship between endothelial nitric oxide availability and insulin resistance. Poor endothelial function, characterized by reduced nitric oxide bioavailability, is associated with impaired glucose uptake in muscle tissue. Interventions that restore endothelial function and nitric oxide production appear to partially reverse this impairment. Isometric exercise, as a stimulus for ENOS activation and nitric oxide production, may therefore have metabolic benefits that extend beyond blood pressure regulation into glucose handling and insulin sensitivity. This research is less mature than the blood pressure literature, and I am not going to overstate what the current evidence supports, but the mechanistic logic is coherent and the early data is directionally consistent. It is a thread worth watching. Let me now bring this back to something personal, because I think there is a human dimension here that does not get discussed enough when we talk about cardiovascular health. The standard framing around blood pressure, arterial health, and cardiovascular risk is implicitly a framing of fear. Lower your blood pressure or face the consequences, reduce your risk or accept the outcome. It is a medical language of threat and prevention. And while that framing is not wrong, it is incomplete. What I find genuinely compelling about this particular mechanism, the ENOS pathway, the endothelial response to shear stress, the arterial compliance adaptation, is that it represents your body's own built-in repair system. Your endothelium is not passively waiting to deteriorate. It is actively maintaining itself. It is sensing, responding, and adapting, and it is doing this right now in real time as blood moves through your vessels. What isometric exercise does is give that system a specific, well-characterized stimulus that causes it to upregulate its own function. You are not forcing an outcome from the outside. You are providing a signal that your vascular biology is already designed to restore. 4 minutes of holding. A wall, a floor, a door frame, your thighs burning, your arteries listening, the endothelium releasing nitric oxide, the smooth muscle relaxing, the artery opening, the pressure falling. This is not a metaphor. This is exactly what is happening in the vessels of people who do this regularly, and the instrumentation to measure it, arterial tonometry, flow-mediated dilation ultrasound, ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, confirms it with a consistency that has now crossed the threshold from interesting signal to clinical recommendation. If you have made it this far and this kind of mechanistic explanation of how your physiology actually works is something you find useful, you want us to go this deep on. The response to those comments shapes what we build next. So where does this leave you practically? The protocol is simple. 3 times a week, you hold a wall sit for 2 minutes, rest for 2 minutes, and repeat that cycle 4 times. 16 total minutes per session. You can substitute isometric hand grip holds if lower body exercise is not accessible to you. You maintain that frequency for 8 to 12 weeks. You do not need special equipment. You do not need a gym membership. You need a wall and the willingness to stay uncomfortable for 2 minutes at a time. The discomfort is not incidental to the benefit. The discomfort is the signal. The burning in your legs during the hold is the metabolic accumulation that triggers the metaboreflex, that drives the shear stress surge on release. that activates ENOS, that produces nitric oxide, that teaches your arteries to be softer and more responsive. Everything you feel during those 4 minutes is the mechanism